welcome to Books in Action. This is Larry Petraccaro and Michael Pucci, and we have with us tonight Laura Sims. Laura's debut novel, Looker, was published by Scribner's to critical acclaim in early 2019. The Wall Street Journal called it a sugar-coated poison pill of psychological terror. And Grazia, UK, called it a dazzlingly creepy storytelling. Looker, an Indie Next Great Reads pick, was featured on best of lists in Vogue, People, Entertainment Weekly, Real Simple, Esquire UK, Southern Living, and more. Looker has been optioned for television by Entertainment One and Emily Mortimer's King Bee Productions. Sims has also published 4 books of poetry, including most recently Staying Alive, her first poetry collection. Practice Restraint was the winner of the 2005 Fence Books Alberta Prize. Laura has been the recipient of a U.S.-Japan Creative Arts Fellowship, and her poetry and prose have appeared in the New Republic, Boston Review, Conjunctions, Gulf Coast, and other journals. She lives in New Jersey with her family, has a MLIS from Queens College, and works at the South Orange Public Library. So Laura, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let me start with this. Your 2019 novel, Looker, has gotten an awful lot of praise here and in the UK. Would you have written the same novel set at the time of the pandemic, or would you have made any subtle or even substantial changes?
That's a good question. The novel is already very focused and even claustrophobic, you might say. It's really kind of has a very tiny set of the narrator's apartment and her neighborhood in Brooklyn. Well, doesn't say it's Brooklyn, but it's Brooklyn. And that's about it. So it kind of already is well suited to these times in that we are often in her apartment. She's alone. Or she's, taking walks and looking in her neighbor's windows. So it's already kind of well suited to the pandemic. I don't know if I would change much. I'm worried about, as a writer, I would be very worried right now about writing a pandemic novel. I feel like there's going to be just a glut of pandemic books. And I'm dreading it personally. I don't even want to see those on the shelves. I don't think I want to relive this time. So I certainly wouldn't, if I wrote about it, I would maybe approach it in a kind of slant way, like not have it be exactly the same as what we're experiencing, but have it be like very claustrophobic, and maybe there's something that is kind of confining the characters to their homes, but just not exactly the same.
But reasonably the same, I suppose.
Yeah.
Can I say, as somebody who orders the books for the library, I'm already dreading the glut of pandemic books
Especially
that I might have to order.
I know, especially memoirs.
Yeah.
Nothing against memoirs, but the pandemic memoirs, I'm waiting.
Yeah. Maybe expanding a little bit, my question is, the pandemic obviously is a huge global thing, but I often wonder the balance for an author or anyone on television, any medium, how much does real life seep into your work? Like, the characters in your book, are they living in the world that we're living in, or is it a few degrees off? Do you use pop culture references, street names, or how do you approach that?
I feel like it's slightly off. In my book, in Looker, most of the characters don't have names, and even Brooklyn isn't named. And it is focused on a celebrity, but I'm not totally sure, but I think the movies that I make up are made up. The movies that I reference in the novel are made up. The other actors and actresses' names are made up. So I feel like it is a world that's a little bit off from ours. I think it would be tricky, and it really dates a novel too, to have these very specific references. So I don't know. That's just, I didn't consciously think about that too much. I really don't like naming characters for some reason, so that's why I avoided it. But I think it's tricky. It's a tricky area.
Well, the book has, as we said earlier, gotten critical acclaim both here and in the UK. Did people see it differently in one place to the other? I'm always curious about, and you said you would write it a little bit off. I don't know if by that you meant you would just use different names and things for streets and people, or if by off you meant that there was sort of a societal shift one way or the other. I wasn't quite clear what you meant.
Oh, I see. Oh, I meant that if I were writing Looker today, I imagine that this whole experience would have influenced me somehow and would seep into the book somehow in some way that I can't even really predict or explain. But that's all that I meant, is that, because we're so influenced by our environment and lives, I think that would come out in the book somehow. Definitely. But your question about the different reception in the UK and here, I really found that the reviews in the UK were more nuanced and more interesting than the ones here. No offense to, American outlets, but and I don't know if that was just a question of how the book was marketed in the different places. I think here there was a tendency to think of it as a thriller, which I don't know if it did it any favors by doing that. Maybe sold more copies, but in terms of like understanding the book as it is, I felt like when I was reading UK reviews, I was much happier, like reading what they said and how they understood the book. So for whatever reason, and it's very different markets, the markets are so different. So who knows?
Who knows? Yeah. I think you've written some reviews yourself, haven't you?
Yeah, not in a long time, but I used to write poetry reviews and I wrote some fiction reviews too.
When you said that you thought the reviews in the UK were more nuanced, could you elaborate a little on that? I guess I know what nuanced means, but
yeah. Well, I think it was more about seeing the book outside of a box. Like I felt like the American reviews were very much operating within the confines of seeing the book as a thriller, right? And so the way they discussed it was always in terms of how it fit into that genre. Where really it's not a traditional thriller. And so I felt like in the UK it was, I think they called it a domestic suspense novel. So that's already a difference. And I think that's a more accurate description of what it is. Thrillers have very certain points to hit, right, in the genre, like, there's a twist and there's a big ending where everything's resolved. And so my book doesn't do that. And I think that was appreciated in the UK in the reviews that I read. It was taken for what it was versus, oh, let's try and cram it into this thriller box.
Yeah.
As someone who has reviewed books,
yeah,
are you able to turn that, I don't know, not that impulse off, but how are you able to work creatively without the reviewer inside you going, no, I wouldn't like that?
It's very hard. It's very hard, especially, I feel like, I wrote Looker in kind of a little cave, and I was just playing and just writing really for myself. I mean, of course I wanted to try to publish it, but I had very low expectations for it and I wasn't thinking about reviews or reception or even readership, because I came from poetry. And in poetry, you don't have a lot of any of that, I mean, there are reviews, but they don't affect sales because sales don't really happen in poetry very much. So unless you're, Billy Collins or Maya Angelou. But now that I've been through the process, It's very hard. It's hard to shut out so many voices, like my agent. Oh, is my agent going to like this next thing? The editor that I worked with, it's very hard, but you kind of have to do it. Or try to, at least try to fool yourself into thinking you're still alone.
Well, when you do the review, do you have like little rules you tend to follow that help you to get through it, whether you like the book or not, or don't like the style or do like the style?
I always chose, because I was, not writing for like major magazines or anything. I was writing for small places mostly about experimental poetry. So I chose books that I found interesting. And to me, it was more about not evaluating the book in terms of this is good, buy it, or this is not good, don't. It was more about taking it on its own terms and just kind of exploring it and analyzing it versus giving it a grade. Excuse me, giving it a grade, which some magazines do. So it was a different kind of reviewing.
Did you start on poetry first before you went into, novels?
I think I started poetry maybe a little bit before. I was writing poetry and fiction when I was younger, but I think the first thing, or one of the first things I ever wrote, was a poem, and it went like this. It's a pair of poems. So the first one was, I like crackers, I like bread, because they're both dead. The companion to this is terrible. Companion to this was, I like mothers, I like fathers, because they're both, there were two boths, dead. So my parents were alive at the time, and who knows? So those were
we can see why you went into domestic suspense here. That's yeah.
Right. I know. Oh gosh.
How before we break, how aware of you? I think I kind of know what you might say. How the expectations of a reader, especially like a thriller, like how oh, it's been a while, I need to deliver a twist here, because I can already see the reader is or is that more of an editor's job to point out, bring it back in?
I really, honestly, when I was writing the book, never thought, oh, this is a thriller. Mm-hmm. So I was not, I was aware of creating suspense and wanting to build that suspense and like momentum. But I think you have to do that in any book. You have to, carry the reader along. So I was aware of that. But yeah, editors can definitely help you do that, like iron that out. Luckily, my editor did not force me to change my ending, which I really love, which is kind of an ambiguous ending. So, and that's not allowed in thrillers. So that's one reason it's not a thriller at all, is because it has this weird ending that ends abruptly.
Well, I'm going to have to end the suspense, and we're going to have a little bit of an ending, because we're going to have to take a break. So we'll be back in about a minute. So if you'll stay with us, we'll be back with Laura Sims, and we'll continue the conversation.
It's an onion.
Hello, welcome back to Books in Action. I'm Michael Pucci with the South Orange Library, along with Larry Petraccaro, my co-host, and we're here today with Laura Sims, my co-worker and author of Looker. Laura, I'm wondering, how much do you reread? I've noticed that I've started to revisit some of the books that I loved, and sometimes I'm scared to do it. Sometimes I want to do it to see if how my taste has changed. How do you approach rereading? I know there's a famous saying that any good book can only be read the second time, or something like that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I haven't done a lot of rereading of like my favorite novels. I would reread poetry, obviously, but novels, I don't reread. Recently, I reread Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And I did have this incredible experience where I was just so blown away. I had been reading a lot of contemporary American fiction and I wasn't crazy about the things I'd read. And I read that and it just blew me away. So that was an incredible rereading experience. And I had forgotten, my memory is terrible at this point. So I'd forgotten so much about the book, and just like I remembered the feeling of it, the atmosphere and some of the details, but it was a great experience. And it reminded me too of why I was drawn to that author. And I think it can be really valuable to do that.
Does anyone else find it weird that it's really the only medium where it seems like a big deal rereading this book?
Oh, I know.
Any other art form, of course,
Yeah.
I've listened to my favorite albums over and over again. I've seen The Godfather 38 times. So why would I when I read a book for the second time, it feels like I'm making a huge decision.
I know, it's true. I guess it's partially the time commitment, right? It's bigger time commitment. Like I always feel like I have to be reading new, not new in terms of newly released, but books I haven't read. But it can be great to go back and revisit those.
Yeah, I recently reread The World According to Garp by John Irving, which 15 years ago was it for me. I thought this was as good as the contemporary novel got. And as I read more of Irving's books, I got less and less. It was like diminishing returns. And then I looked at that book and thought, oh, what if I don't like it again?
Right.
So I stayed away from it. And then I finally did reread it last winter, and I still enjoyed it a lot.
Loved it. Yeah. Oh yeah. I love Irving's novels.
He is a little different. I've only read a couple of his, but he does seem to take a slightly different approach to the world. But when you reread a book, do you reread it because you want to see if it's different? Michael, you both obviously have done that. I mean, I reread a book if I do, which I've done. There's several I've read several times. It's because I like them and I expect to get the same experience. But I wonder if maybe from your perspective, the two of you read it to see if you get a different experience.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if I set out to reread it to get a different experience, but it is definitely different each time. And I think, especially with books that you read long ago and revisit, you come to them with this different perspective. So right now I'm reading Paul Auster's novel 4321, which is a novel about this character growing up in northern New Jersey, right around here, South Orange, Maplewood. But it's 4 different versions of his life. And it starts with, when he's very little and goes, and I'm not sure how far it goes into his life. I'm not finished, but I have never read it before. But as I'm reading it, when I read Paul Auster the first time, I read like his early works, and I was in my 20s. And those works felt to me like they were my 20s in this way. And right now, reading this book as the mother of a son, and the book is about a boy with, close relationship to his mother, I'm reading it as a mother. And I know that if I had read it earlier in my life, I would be reading it very differently. Like I would be identifying with Ferguson, this character, much more closely. But instead, I'm like watching him like a mother and thinking about these things he's facing. So it's interesting.
How about you, Michael? When you reread The World According to Garth, the one by Irving, did you see it differently than you did the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same reason that you listen to your favorite album that you've memorized. You want to be back into its rhythms and its characters, and it's like seeing old friends. And I do find that the first time I read a book, you're so locked in on plot, what's going to happen next, and on that. Whereas the second time, I already know how it's going to end, so I'm not really focused on that. I can luxuriate in the language a little more.
Yeah.
So I can understand why a really good novel you would want to read twice.
Yeah.
And I also, that book in particular really touches on some things which I have to assume in the whenever it was published, late 70s, 80s, was really I mean, there's a transgender character, there's violence again, it's really about violence against women. And and here we are 40 years later having that conversation. So maybe he was prescient in some ways.
Wow.
But again, but 20 years ago, I would not have been tapped into that. And then this time rereading it, that's all I could think about.
Prescient, or perhaps humanity doesn't change from year to year. I wonder sometimes about that. If there's maybe there's a time for a place for everything, right? Or nothing new under the sun, whatever it could be.
Now, here's something. When I read Garp, I've seen the movie with Robin Williams and John Lithgow and other books that have been made into movies. Laura, your book is going to be made into a movie, and I'm wondering, as an author, I mean, that I'm sure very exciting, but I sometimes wonder if authors, while they love the attention it brings, I can't get Robin Williams' head out of my mind when I'm reading the book now.
No,
So
I know. That's too bad. That is unfortunate, and you definitely have that effect. It's exciting. I guess I've been happy because the team that's doing it, I really respect them, and they seem to really understand the book. And they hired these two great screenwriters for it and I read the screenplay and I think it's amazing. It's funny, like it's more obviously funny than the book is. And I think that's the right direction to go in. But yeah, it's strange to think the people who pick up the book after seeing that, they're going to have these images in their head already, which is part of the pleasure, of course, of reading as you imagine these things. But what can you do? I'll take it if it happens. If it actually happens, I'll take it.
And you should.
I know. I know.
What do you think about, Michael? This is something you might, I think you were interested in as well. Was the let's say present day bias in classical literature? We have feelings about things today that that we might find offensive, that maybe at one point in time, 200-300 years ago, weren't offensive. They were normalized, if you will. So if you read, I don't know, Huckleberry Finn or David Copperfield or something, do you think we can appreciate it the way it might have been appreciated when it first came out, or should we, for that matter?
Well, also, I guess also as a librarian, I mean, the Huck Finn in particular, besides the historical importance of that novel, the movement to censor it doesn't sit well with me. And even on a much lesser scale, this thing with Dr. Seuss, the removing of the books, the publisher decided to remove a handful of books because of outdated imagery. The question is, do we remove it as a library? And my feeling on that is no. What we have is an opportunity to educate that these are hurtful and these are offensive, and here's why. But in his time, he obviously it never came up for him. So there's a learning opportunity there.
Yes, I agree. I totally agree. I think it is a teachable moment. And I think if you start pulling offensive books, we're going to be left with nothing. I mean, all of the books I've read that have been, filled with misogynistic references. And I mean, I would have to just burn my whole library, my personal library. I don't know where that would end. It's not smart.
I'll throw in my 2 cents. I tend to agree with you. I think, censorship, even if it's with the best of intentions, is something that I would fear, I guess, because there can be a very logical conclusion to that kind of stuff. And a lot of times people, I think, will feel that, no, that could never happen. But things happen. I think they can happen. So can we shift to poetry a minute?
Sure.
And the one of the things that caught my attention was one of your books of poetry was called, I think, Practice Restraint. And yet you put a comma between practice and restraint. And
Mhm.
that kind of caught my attention because it seems like it would mean something different with the comma and something different without the comma. Can you comment on that?
Comment on the comma.
Yeah, comment on the comma.
That comma is very important. Yeah, I feel like my poetry and my prose, but my poetry is very spare. And so like I tend towards the kind of Emily Dickinson, William Carlos Williams, that kind of lineage, right? Very short lines, very stripped down. But I also want to have wildness, right, of imagery and interesting things happening in the poem. So I feel like there's always this balancing act between chaos and control, and that's true in fiction too. And so that's kind of what practice, restraint is about. Like, you are taking the chaos and taming it, but you also have to let some of that live so the poem is alive. And I think it's something that you do over and over again. So like it never ends, right? You're not just practicing restraint, but you're practicing restraint, practice restraint. Like it goes on forever. So yeah, that's something that, as I said, I apply to all my writing, is like trying to find that balance
Between chaos and
control. Writing, a lot of writing is about control and like controlling those words on the page, but you also don't want to control it to the point that you kill it. So it's a balancing act.
So you want to set it free in a sense, right?
Set it free, but to a point.
How do you know when you've reached that equilibrium?
Oh, I don't know, just a feeling. Just a hope. You hope you've done it.
Do you have a favorite poem?
I don't know if I have a favorite poem. I used to teach modernism course at NYU to continuing ed students, and we read Eliot and Virginia Woolf, and I love the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock.
That was T.S. Eliot, wasn't it? Yeah.
What's that?
Well, T.S. Eliot was.
T.S. Eliot, yeah.
Eliot.
So well, I do love it.
We right now have to make a decision between chaos and control.
Okay.
Control would tell us it's time that we have to say goodnight. But chaos, we could make it a little more difficult but no. I think, Laura, thank you so much for joining Michael and me. And it's been great to have you. But I guess control has to win out at this point in time. Thank you for joining us on Books in Action.
Thank you.
Take care.
Good night.